The life of Evert Langelett. Evert was born December 20th, 1936 in Bray Township, Pennington County, Minnesota. He was promoted to glory Friday, May 24th, 2024 at his home in Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Evert was born with one arm wrapped around his head and one leg 2 inches shorter. He would have 20 surgeries over his lifetime. As a child, he had 2 lengthy stays in the children's hospital in the cities, one for polio and one for leg calvé-Pertez disease, the latter requiring wearing a brace for over a year, resulting in some of the kids calling him peg leg. Also, when he was born, he was allergic to his mother's milk, so they had to get milk from a neighbor's cow. At 18, he was asked if he wanted to go on disability. He replied, "Definitely not." Evert was the youngest of 12 children. When he was young, he would stutter. His first grade teacher often reprimanded him in front of the class. This affected Evert deeply. Though as an adult, he rarely stuttered. However, it did make English his very least favorite subject. At age 7, his father passed away from an infection. He had to man up and help take care of the family farm. As a child, he grew up on a farm west of TRF. He was the only member of the family who loved to hunt, fish, and trap. Often, Evert would shoot rabbits or squirrels, and the family would have rabbit or squirrels for supper. Other nights, after school, he would fish and bring home fish for supper. He loved to trap. One time, he caught a beaver and he had to carry it a long way going home. It was too heavy, and right then he decided not to trap beaver ever again. However, once he caught 3 mink and got $35 each. That was a lot of money in those days. That was a super happy day for him. After high school, he wanted to study engineering at the University of Minnesota. On the entrance exam, he scored in the top 5% in math, but unfortunately for him, he was in the bottom 1% in English. That ended his dream of becoming an engineer. But it also led to choices that would change the whole course of his life. He decided to go to trade school in St. Louis, Missouri, and become a diesel mechanic. He really enjoyed the training in the city. He often said that it was one of his happiest years. Betty always added, "Up to that point." After trade school, Evert went to work for Allis Chalmers Tractors in Minneapolis and attended Bethlehem Baptist Church. While attending Bethlehem Baptist, he heard about Operation Mobilization, a young mission group whose goal was that every person in the world should have the opportunity to hear the gospel at least once. Evert heard they needed mechanics. He learned that OM would purchase old Bedford bread trucks retired from service in England, and then take them to Belgium, where there was an OM mechanics base to repair vehicles. The trucks were needed to take teams and literature from Brussels to Iran and India. Evert went to Belgium and helped repair and prepare the trucks. He also took the journey as a driver and mechanic. The trucks usually would leave 3 days apart, and Evert drove the last truck. If one of the trucks ahead broke down, they could switch drivers, and he would then stay and fix the truck needing repairs. He would make that trip 4 times, driving through Belgium, Germany, Austria, Yugoslavia, Greece, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and finally into India. His favorite country was Iran. He said the pomegranates, papaya, and pistachios were amazing. When he made his 4th and last trip after he and Betty were married, he brought her a huge pomegranate from Iran. One OM report about the first journey was dated December 1st, 1964, from Mashhad, Iran. To George Verwer. Greetings from the town of Mashhad. In trying to get here, we have had the following go wrong. On the Volkswagen, broken crankshaft, broken torsion bar, back wheel plate smashed, 1 inner tube ruined, 1 broken accelerator cable. On the Bedford truck, 1 front and 2 back springs broken, an oil leak which caused the big end bearing to go. A sump pump gasket has also been a continual worry. When you consider that we have traveled over 4,500 kilometers in such old vehicles, it is a miracle that we got this far so easily. Our financial situation is not too good, but we believe the Lord will take us through. He shall supply. Apologies for scattered weekly reports. It's difficult. Rejoicing in Him, Ron George. After each trip, Evert would return home. He had begun a small business that he worked on between trips. After Evert's third trip, he was challenged by some of the mechanics that since he was a businessman, he might want to grow that business so that instead of working on old trucks, they could purchase new trucks for the trip each year. After prayer, Evert believed this was God's calling for his life. Throughout the rest of his life, his goal was to help missions, both OM and other groups. Upon reaching India the first time, Evert had a disagreement regarding how something was done on OM. He left OM and went to Assam, India to visit a missionary he knew from Bethlehem Baptist Church. While there, he had an opportunity to help hunt for a tiger that was terrorizing some villages. That was quite exciting, and they did get the tiger. But another thing happened. OM's leader, George Verwer, heard that he had left and contacted Evert to try and find out why he had left. They corresponded back and forth and began a friendship that would last throughout their lifetimes. Evert's oldest son, George, was named after George Verwer. In India, he also caught typhoid fever. While recovering, he was very weak and needed to take a train trip. The trains in India are very crowded, and to secure a seat, people entered not only through the door, but would also climb in through a window. Since Evert was very weak, some of his friends put him through a window into the train and succeeded, except the people inside the train pushed him back out of the window again. Poor Evert. Finally, he did get on the train. While in Brussels working on trucks, a fellow mechanic's wife knew of a lady from Minnesota. She told Evert about her and showed him her picture. She was from Argyle, Minnesota, and had spent 2 summers in Mexico with OM, and her name was Betty Bagus. Instead of contacting Betty, Evert began praying and sometimes fasting to be sure about the Lord's will to know if they were meant for each other. When he returned to Minnesota in August, that same friend arranged a blind date for them. They married the following June. Betty said, "With all that praying, I never stood a chance." Evert and Betty were married June 1st, 1968 in Argyle, Minnesota. They had decided to spend their first year serving on OM, with Evert working on trucks in Brussels and Betty in the accounting office. However, at the conference in September, Evert was asked if he would be willing to go to Thailand and check out the possibility of purchasing Army vehicles from the U.S. Army for use in India. Betty and Evert discussed and prayed about it and then agreed, even though this was a major change. It meant Betty, who was expecting their first child, would need to fly to India and work in the headquarters there, while Evert would go with the trucks overland. A month later, when Evert arrived in India, they traveled to Calcutta, then flew to Bangkok, Thailand. Their son, George Lorence, was born there. When they returned home in late November, they moved to Thief River Falls, Minnesota. Evert purchased an old school bus, painted it green, and started driving to Fargo, Minneapolis, Chicago, and St. Louis, buying high-speed cutting tools, and then traveling around the northwest area of Minnesota and into North Dakota selling them. He also bought a warehouse on Atlantic Avenue in Thief River Falls. Evert got his start in drill bits from the Graff brothers in Chicago, who had a warehouse full of high-quality used bits. They allowed him to take a truckload of square shank drill bits made during World War I on trust and to pay as he sold them. Evert hired people to help him turn the shanks down and sharpen the drills. He would continue to buy from the Graff brothers through the years. In fact, on their honeymoon, Evert and Betty spent a full day in the warehouse, sorting through huge piles of drills. Betty, under Everett's direction, sorted too. She jokes that, though she went through one pair of gloves, she really didn't have a clue about what she was doing. Through the years, his business, Midwest Hardware and Wholesale, continued to grow. He also began buying and selling farmland. Always, though, the driving force behind all he did was the task he had been given to support those taking the good news, the gospel, to those who had never yet had a chance to hear about Jesus. That would include not just OM, but many other missions like Wycliffe and Voice of the Martyrs. He also tithed faithfully to his own church, First Baptist, and the last few years, Epiphany Station. One of the first questions he often asked people was, "Where do you go to church?" And if they didn't have a church home, and sometimes even if they did, he would invite them to visit our church. He was always grateful for a place to worship and serve, and for the lifelong friendship made there. Betty and Evert enjoyed watching George grow, and on October of 1972, their second son, Einar Arthur, was born in TRF. As the boys grew, Evert would take the boys down to the dam fishing, or they would all go to spend time with Betty's parents. Almost every Sunday, Evert and Betty's father, Einar, would drive around the countryside looking at the crops and the wildlife. It seemed like most Sundays they would not come home until they got the pickup truck stuck at least one time. Each Sunday before leaving, George would remind Evert and Grandpa Einar, "Do you have the boards for under the wheels? Do you have the jack? Do you have the chain and the winch?" Evert and Einar would just laugh as they loaded up the back of the pickup because they knew it was true. Though Evert worked long hours, every Friday night after supper was a family night. It was a time of playing board games or fun activities they all enjoyed together. On Easter Sunday, 1979, someone broke into Everett's warehouse on Atlantic Avenue. To cover their tracks, they set his warehouse on fire. Unfortunately, the firemen had a very difficult time putting out the fire with the old insulation in the building. Double unfortunately, Evert did not have fire insurance on the building. Evert often bought drill bits by bidding on lots from companies like Caterpillar. After the fire, it was decided to move closer to that area. In the summer of 1979, the family moved to Bristol, Indiana, and they stayed there until the spring of 1985. Unfortunately for Evert, the climate in Indiana is much more humid than northern Minnesota, and many of his drill bits rusted, partially due to drills rusting and partly because he had purchased a piece of farmland in Minnesota. It was decided to move back. When the Hugo's grocery store opened in TRF, Evert and the manager became friends. Evert realized that a lot of food, day-old bakery goods, and deli items were simply discarded. He asked permission to pick up the items being thrown away and to take them up north to feed the deer, and he was allowed to do that for a number of years. The deer and bear enjoyed a smorgasbord of sweet treats, as well as plain stuff too. Betty joked that Evert would need to bring a dentist up for the deer because of all the sweet pastries they kept eating.
They eat 14 55-gallon drums of stuff a week.
Coming up, see how many deer show up for this free meal.
Oofda! We realize this is getting way too long, so please bear with us for just a bit longer. Let's close with this. He continued to enjoy his work with drills and land management. He enjoyed writing in spite of scoring 1% in English, and had 8 articles published in the Minnesota Deer Hunters magazine, White Tails. He enjoyed the many, many, many friendships that developed through the years. People were really important to him. He loved his family dearly, and they loved him. He enjoyed his church and teaching children in Sunday school. He enjoyed hunting with his family and friendship. Finally, he enjoyed wildlife and doing things to protect their habitat. He once donated 80 acres to the state of Minnesota for wildlife habitat and had one piece of land in an easement to protect the rare plants there. Everett's son George was married in August 2001 to Laura Newell. Everett's grandson, Ian Langelett, was born in February 2005. Everett's granddaughter, Ariana Langelett, was born in March 2012. He enjoyed the gift of life the Lord had given him. When his memory began to fade, and Betty had begun making all the decisions about the land and his drills, the decisions he had always made, she asked him if he minded. He looked down a moment and was quiet, and then he looked up and smiled. "No," he said. She asked at different times how he was feeling, and he would answer, happy or content. And he was, and even with dementia, as he enjoyed each day. As a child, Evert had strep throat, and without antibiotics, it went to his heart, causing rheumatic fever and damaged his heart valves. That resulted in Evert needing open heart surgery in 2015 and having his heart valve replaced. The next year, he had the second hip replacement, and because his bone was thin, needed a bone graft. He developed a severe case of shingles and then cancer inside his nose. Through those years, his memory began to fade, but till almost the end, he enjoyed each day, and he and Betty communicated well, and he liked being with people. During those years of less work and more time, Evert would sit at the kitchen table and would read his Bible. Then he would take a binder of prayer letters from missionaries around the world and pray through it. He may have prayed for you. Not only did he have the binder, he also had his 1955 class yearbook and would pray for all his classmates, or if deceased, their families. He had a list of countries of the world, and a list of the churches in TRF, and a list of neighbors and friends. He prayed for each. Evert passed away peacefully, knowing that his work on earth was complete. His favorite Bible verse was John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whosoever believes in him might not perish, but have everlasting life. To believe that is to have peace with God. What an amazing gift.